Before the French arrived, the tribes of Wisconsin were masters of a vast wilderness. After, they became the lowest paid employees in a continent-spanning corporation whose only product was fur. They traded stone axes for iron ones, and timeless independence for immediate dependence. They just didn't know the full price of that transaction. By the time the bill came due, it was too late to cancel the contract, and the cost was their entire world. Before the French showed up with their iron pots and their promises, Wisconsin was not an empty wilderness waiting for a purpose. It was a world in full motion, a landscape of dense northern forests and sprawling southern prairies that had its own rules and its own masters. This was a land teeming with a variety of wildlife that sounds like a fantasy today. Woodland caribou, moose, elk, and massive herds of bison roamed the plains. It was a functioning ecosystem, a self-contained universe where every inhabitant, especially the human ones, was wonderfully adapted to a life woven directly into the fabric of the forests and fields. This wasn't a life of quiet communion with nature. It was a life of constant, ingenious, and demanding work. Survival depended almost entirely on what could be hunted or gathered, with every piece of food, shelter, clothing, and weaponry pulled directly from the surrounding environment. The people here didn't just live in the wilderness, they were a part of its rhythm, their lives dictated by the turning of the seasons. Their homes were marvels of temporary architecture, designed to be abandoned and rebuilt as they followed the resources. For the harsh winters, they built the iconic wigwam. The process was brutally efficient. Wooden poles were set in the ground to form an oval, then bent and tied at the top to create a domed roof. The women of the tribe, who were the designated engineers and movers of this society, would then cover the frame with reed mats and sheets of birch bark. This wasn't laziness on the part of the men, as many white observers mistakenly assumed. It was practical. While the women carried the camp, the men kept their hands free, ready to fend off a surprise enemy attack or kill any game they happened upon. Inside the wigwam, life was Spartan and centered on a fire pit dug into the floor. The fire provided both heat and a cooking surface, with the smoke escaping through a simple hole in the roof. The family's few possessions were stored neatly: sleeping mats and furs, spare deerskin clothing, and leggings and moccasins beautifully decorated with intricate designs embroidered from dyed porcupine quills. When summer arrived, the camp moved, and the architecture changed. The new lodges were rectangular with inverted V-shaped roofs, looking much like a modern house, but covered entirely in strips of elm or other bark. It was a system that worked, a mobile and adaptable existence perfectly suited to the world they inhabited. Long before the first European trader offered a metal pot, the people of Wisconsin were master craftsmen with a deep understanding of their local resources. March was the season for making sugar. They would tap the maple trees, collect the sap in birch bark containers, and boil it down for weeks. First, it became syrup. Then it was reduced further into hard blocks of maple sugar. This sugar was more than a treat. It was a high-energy food source that could be stored indefinitely, a critical reserve for lean times. This was their version of a pantry staple, created with nothing more than fire, bark, and patience. When a new cooking vessel was needed, the women would go to a clay bed near the river. They mixed the clay with coarse sand, rolled it into long cylinders, and then carefully coiled these cylinders into the shape of a pot. After drying, the pot was baked in a large outdoor fire. The result was a functional, if fragile, ceramic pot perfect for boiling water or cooking food. It had the distinct advantage of being easily replaced if it broke, a closed-loop system of production and consumption. Agriculture, though secondary to hunting, was also part of their arsenal. In May, the women and girls would prepare a garden, planting corn, squash, and beans in small, carefully tended hillocks, ensuring a diverse and reliable food supply for the coming months. Hunting was often a communal affair, a complex operation requiring coordination and strategy. For a deer hunt, the men would fell trees in two long, gradually narrowing rows, creating a corridor that stretched for more than a mile. Other members of the tribe would then drive the deer toward this man-made funnel. As the terrified animals ran into the narrow opening, hunters stationed with bows and arrows could easily pick them off. It was a ruthlessly effective system for acquiring large amounts of meat, which would then be cut into strips and smoke-dried for preservation. The ingenuity didn't stop there. They invented a form of slow cooker by cleaning out a deer's stomach, tying it shut to form a pouch, and filling it with venison, edible roots, and wild rice. This pouch was then suspended over a low fire, slowly simmering its contents into a delicious stew served in bowls made of birch bark. As autumn arrived, the focus shifted to the harvest. Corn was the most important crop, gathered and dried on the ear to be ground into meal as needed throughout the winter. But the most vital wild food was wild rice, which grew in immense quantities in the shallow lakes. Harvesting it was both a practical and spiritual event. Before anyone entered the water, a medicine man would approach the shore and offer tobacco smoke to the heavens as a gift to the master of the rice. Only after this offering could the harvest begin. The collected grain was dried, heated to pop the husks open, and then trodden upon in a skin-lined pit to separate the kernels. Finally, the women would toss the grain in the air using winnowing trays, letting the wind blow the light chaff away, leaving only the clean, nourishing kernels. They had built a world that worked, a finely tuned machine of survival and culture. They had no idea it was all about to become obsolete, replaced by a bargain that would demand a price they couldn't possibly imagine. The self-contained world of the Wisconsin tribes was a finely tuned machine, but it was built on a foundation of isolation. In 1634, the first crack appeared in that foundation. A Frenchman named Jean Nicolet paddled his canoe ashore near what is now Green Bay, dressed in a grand damask robe, and fired 2 pistols into the air. He wasn't a conqueror. His mission was diplomacy, an attempt to broker peace between the powerful local Winnebago tribe and the Ottawa, who were already acting as middlemen in the burgeoning French fur trade. At that moment, Wisconsin's known residents were the Winnebago, the Menominee along their namesake river, and scattered villages of Santee Sioux to the west. They were a diverse people with distinct languages and customs, completely unaware that Nicolet wasn't an envoy from another world, but the advance scout for a tidal wave of change. While Wisconsin remained on the fringe of European awareness, a geopolitical bomb had already gone off in the east. The Dutch, operating out of their settlements, had made a calculated business decision. They armed their trading partners, the Iroquois Confederacy, with guns. This single act unleashed the most potent Indian military force in North America. The Iroquois, now possessing a massive technological advantage, launched a campaign of conquest that was terrifying in its speed and brutality. They virtually exterminated the Huron, the Erie, and the Tobacco Nation. This wasn't just warfare. It was an existential threat that sent shockwaves across the continent. Entire tribes, stripped of their ancestral lands and fleeing for their lives, began a desperate migration west. Suddenly, the relative security of the Wisconsin wilderness looked like a paradise. A flood of refugee tribes poured in. The Muscouton, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Sauk, and Fox all arrived after Nicolet's visit, seeking sanctuary from the Iroquois storm. They were soon followed by remnants of the Huron and Ottawa. This created a massive, destabilizing refugee crisis. The resident Winnebago, once the dominant power in the region, fiercely defended their territory against these invaders. But the constant warfare, combined with devastating new plagues like smallpox that traveled faster than any trader, shattered their strength. Decimated and exhausted, the Winnebago were forced to make peace, allowing the Algonquian-speaking newcomers to settle along the Fox and Wolf rivers, forever changing the demographic and political map of Wisconsin. The chaos of the displacement created the perfect market conditions for the next phase of the French arrival. Sometime after 1654, 2 young adventurous Frenchmen named Radisson and Groseilliers became the first known white traders to venture into Wisconsin. They came not with flags or crosses, but with goods. Even before their arrival, the superiority of European technology was already known. Iron knives, steel axes, and metal kettles, trickling in through intertribal trade networks, had made a powerful impression. A stone axe took days to chip into shape and shattered easily. An iron axe was a tool for life. The sales pitch wrote itself. This wasn't a hard sell, it was an obvious upgrade. The trickle of goods soon became a flood. By 1668, a trader named Nicholas Perrot was operating at Green Bay, and he brought with him the two most powerful accelerators of the trade: guns and brandy. The French quickly realized that these items could dramatically increase the tempo of fur trapping. A rifle could take down a deer from a distance, a bow could never reach, and alcohol could be a potent tool of persuasion and control. The deal being offered was simple. In exchange for the pelts of beaver and other animals, the French would provide the tools that made life and hunting easier, and the drinks that made it feel that way. It was an offer the battered and dislocated tribes of Wisconsin could not refuse. The adoption of European goods was a revolution that happened so fast and so completely that within a few short generations, the old ways were all but forgotten. The ancient knowledge of how to craft stone tools, fire pottery vessels, or even make effective bows and arrows simply vanished. Why would anyone spend the time when a superior product was available for the price of a few animal skins? This shift didn't just change their toolkits, it fundamentally rewired their entire economy and way of life. The tribe's need for the white man's goods grew relentlessly, and with it, their dependence on the trader. The hunter, once a self-sufficient provider for his family, was transformed into something else. In a very real sense, he became an employee in a great continent-spanning fur factory. This new factory had its own rules. To manage the trade, the French government issued a limited number of licenses, or congés, each year. But the vast, unpoliced wilderness was filled with unlicensed, illegal traders known as coureurs de bois, or runners of the woods. These outlaws operated outside the law, trading whatever they could, often using the cheapest, most corrosive brandy to maximize their profits. To bring some order to the chaos, formal trading posts were established at key locations by men like Nicolas Perrot and Sieur de Duluth. These posts weren't just stores, they were the regional headquarters for the French enterprise, designed to control the flow of furs out of the territory and the flow of goods in. The traders were not the only Frenchmen with an agenda in Wisconsin. They were accompanied by Jesuit missionaries, the famed Black Robes, who hoped to convert the tribes to Christianity. These priests were often incredibly brave explorers, charting unknown territory and documenting their experiences. But their primary mission was largely a failure. The warrior cultures of Wisconsin found little appeal in a religion that preached humility, a trait they often viewed as feminine. The French government also had its own goals, periodically attempting to relocate tribes, form them into manageable confederacies, and civilize them with French language and customs. But of these three forces, the trader, the priest, and the politician, only the trader succeeded in materially changing the Indian way of life. His success was unintentional, a byproduct of a commercial transaction, but it was more profound and permanent than any sermon or decree. This new reality was mapped onto the continent in 1673. Father Jacques Marquette, a Jesuit priest, and Louis Joliet, an explorer, traveled up the Fox River, portaged over to the Wisconsin River, and followed it down to the mighty Mississippi. Their voyage proved the existence of a continuous water route from the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, effectively opening the heart of the continent to French ambition. The once isolated lands of Wisconsin were now a critical highway in a global empire. The local tribes were no longer just suppliers of fur, they were inhabitants of a strategically vital territory, and they would soon be drafted into the empire's larger conflicts, whether they wanted to be or not. The deal had been struck, the goods delivered, and the price of dependence would soon be calculated in decades of war and loss. The French had built a continent-spanning fur factory, but it was inefficient. Their employees, the various tribes of the western Great Lakes, were scattered across thousands of square miles of dense wilderness. This made managing the supply chain a nightmare. Around 1701, the French military decided on a new corporate strategy: centralization. The plan was to consolidate the western tribes around a few major fortified centers, like Detroit. Here, the French could control the trade, defend their assets, and, they hoped, slowly civilize the native population by teaching them French and integrating them into the colonial economy. It was a neat plan on paper, a classic top-down corporate restructuring. But it had one fatal flaw. It ignored the complex, centuries-old rivalries of the people they were trying to manage. And one tribe, the Fox, was about to throw a wrench in the entire machine. The Fox, known for their fierce independence, occupied the most strategic piece of real estate in the entire French trading network. The Fox River Waterway in Wisconsin. This was the main highway connecting the French outposts in the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River and their Sioux trading partners in the West. The Fox understood its value perfectly. To prevent the French from supplying guns to their mortal enemies, the Sioux, they simply shut the highway down, halting French traders and strangling the flow of commerce. They were a rogue department refusing to cooperate, and the CEO, the French governor, needed them brought into line. The commandant at Detroit, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, thought he had the solution. In 1710, he formally invited the Fox and their allies to leave Wisconsin and settle near his fort. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The arrival of the Fox, along with their allies the Kickapoo, Sauk, and Mascoutin, was not a peaceful relocation. It was the spark in a powder keg. Detroit was already crowded with tribes like the Ottawa and Huron, who had their own bitter histories with the newcomers. After a minor skirmish between a Muscoutin and an Ottawa, the situation exploded. The Fox launched a revenge attack, and Cadillac, siding with his established allies, allowed the Ottawa and Huron to take refuge inside the French fort. The Fox, betrayed, erected their own stockade nearby and prepared for a long fight. What happened next was not a battle, but a calculated extermination. The French were soon reinforced by a massive war party of their allies, including the Illinois, Missouri, Osage, and Potawatomi. This overwhelming force laid siege to the Fox Fort. After 19 brutal days, the starving Fox attempted to escape during a dark, rainy night. They were hunted down, overtaken, and slaughtered. The French and their allies were determined to wipe them out completely. This massacre did not end the conflict, it guaranteed a wider war. The surviving Fox back in the Wisconsin forests were not broken. They were enraged. They began a new war, a war of pure extermination, against any tribe that had participated in the Detroit massacre. French trade ground to a halt as the waterways became a battleground. In response, the French sent the first white army ever to invade Wisconsin in the summer of 1716. Led by Sieur de Louvigny, several hundred French soldiers and their own native allies marched into the forest, besieged the main Fox village, and forced a surrender after 3 days. The peace terms were severe. The Fox had to pay for the war with a fortune in furs, return all prisoners, and hand over hostages. The French believed they had finally put the matter to rest. They were wrong. The peace treaty was little more than a temporary ceasefire. The Fox, led by a brilliant and charismatic war chief named Kiala, were not just warriors, they were shrewd politicians. They took advantage of the growing hostility between the French colonies in Canada and Louisiana to launch new attacks on the Illinois tribe. Kiala, meanwhile, was busy building a grand alliance that would dwarf any the French could muster. He reached out not just to old allies like the Kickapoo and Muscoutin, but to tribes across the continent. He forged agreements with the Winnebago, the Dakota Sioux, the Iowa, and the Missouri in the west, and even the Seneca and Abnaki in the east. Kiala's plan was to encircle the French with a ring of hostile tribes and achieve their complete defeat. It was an astonishing feat of international diplomacy, a direct challenge to the entire French imperial project. Panicked, the French organized another, even larger army in 1728, with 400 French soldiers and 1,000 native allies under the command of Sieur de Lignery. It was a complete fiasco. The Potawatomi, playing a double game, warned the Fox of the army's approach. When the massive expeditionary force arrived at the Fox villages, they found them empty, the cook fires still warm. The allied warriors refused to march any farther into the wilderness on a fool's errand, and a humiliated Delignery had to settle for burning the deserted villages and food stores before retreating. But Kiala's Grand Confederacy was too fragile to last. One by one, the French bribed or intimidated his allies into abandoning him. Even the Fox's oldest friends, the Mousqueton and Kickapoo, were persuaded to turn against them. Defeated by a smaller French force and with nowhere left to run, the Fox made a desperate decision. They would abandon Wisconsin and seek refuge in the lands of the Iroquois in the east. Their flight ended in one final horrific massacre. French officers from nearby posts hastily gathered their allies and cornered the fleeing Fox. The Fox warriors threw up a hasty stockade and fought for their lives for 23 days. When they tried to slip away on a stormy night, they were quickly run down. Almost the entire band, men, women, and children, were either slaughtered on the spot or captured and sold into slavery. Chief Kiala himself was taken in chains to Montreal. The few survivors who made it back to their village on the Wisconsin River were then attacked again. The tribe was shattered. The remnants, in a final act of survival, merged with their steadfast allies, the Sauk. After one last bloody battle near modern-day Menasha, a place whose name allegedly means Hill of the Dead, the newly amalgamated Sauk and Fox tribe fled across the Mississippi into Iowa, leaving their ancestral homeland behind forever. The Fox Wars were eventually brought to an end, not by extermination, but by the more practical policy of conciliation introduced by a new commandant, Paul Marin, in the 1740s. But the damage to the French position was already done. The decades of warfare had bled them of resources and prestige. By 1736, their other key trading partners, the Sioux, had turned against them, angered by French friendship with their enemies, the Chippewa and Cree. They murdered a French officer, a priest, and 19 boatmen, ensuring the Sioux could no longer be counted as French allies. The entire French system in the West was beginning to unravel. The fatal blow, however, came from the East. The ongoing global conflict between Britain and France, known as King George's War, crippled French shipping. Goods became scarce in the Western territories. The fur trade was a two-way street. If the French couldn't supply the iron tools, guns, and cloth the tribes now depended on, the deal was off. For the first time, tribes in Wisconsin began looking to the British as a more reliable source of goods. The French alliance was held together in these final years by sheer force of will, embodied by one man, Charles de Langlade. Part French and part Ottawa, Langlade had tremendous influence among the Western tribes. He led war parties to attack pro-British villages, and in 1755, he and his contingent of Wisconsin warriors, including Chippewa, Menominee, Potawatomi, and Winnebago, were instrumental in the famous battle that resulted in General Braddock's defeat. Trophies from that battle would be found in Wisconsin lodges for years to come. But Langlade was fighting a losing battle. The British military and economic machine was too powerful. By 1761, British troops had taken control of Wisconsin, and in 1763, France formally surrendered the rest of its American empire. For the tribes of Wisconsin, the end of French rule came with one last cruel twist of the knife. The Potawatomi warriors who had fought so fiercely for Langlade returned home from the siege of a British fort carrying more than just stories of the war. They brought smallpox. The disease, contracted from English soldiers, swept through their villages, killing indiscriminately. The epidemic raged through Wisconsin, and in the ensuing chaos, many tribes left the region entirely, some never to return. The French era was over. The tribes now had a new employer, the British, but the terms of the contract remained the same. They were still dependent, still trapped, and the price of the deal was only going to get higher. When the French Empire in America collapsed, the tribes of Wisconsin didn't gain their freedom. They were handed over to a new owner. The transition from French to British rule was less a liberation and more an awkward corporate merger where the new management had a completely different philosophy. In the 17th of October 61, a British officer, Ensign James Gorrell, arrived at Green Bay with a handful of men and set about restoring the old French fort, renaming it Fort Edward Augustus. The tribes soon discovered that their new landlords operated on a different set of principles. The French had built their empire on personal relationships, intermarriage, and a liberal policy of gift-giving that acknowledged the tribes as crucial partners. The British saw things differently. They were not inclined to give lavish presents, and it was certainly not their policy to fraternize or marry their savage allies. This cold, detached approach created a powerful feeling of inferiority and resentment among many tribes who were accustomed to being treated with a certain degree of respect. The deal had changed, and the benefits package had been severely downgraded. Not all of Wisconsin was immediately hostile. Ensign Gorell was a skilled diplomat, and he managed to win the loyalty of the Sauk, Fox, Winnebago, and Menominee. These tribes already held a grudge against the French for past betrayals and wars, and Gorell's fair treatment convinced them to side with the British. This fragile alliance would prove to be critical because a storm of violent resistance was brewing to the east. In 1763, an Ottawa chief named Pontiac, one of the most capable leaders of his generation, orchestrated a massive pan-tribal uprising. His plan was breathtaking in its ambition: to unite every tribe from the Allegheny Mountains to the Mississippi River in a coordinated effort to drive the British and their colonists into the sea. It was a declaration of war against the new management. The rebellion exploded across the frontier with stunning success. On the 2nd of June, 1763, Fort Michilimackinac, the most important British post in the Upper Great Lakes, fell in an act of brilliant deception. Local Chippewa warriors staged a game of lacrosse just outside the fort's walls. As the game grew more intense, they accidentally knocked the ball through the open gate. As the players rushed in, supposedly to retrieve it, their watching women opened the blankets they were wearing to reveal a cache of hidden weapons. The warriors seized the guns and tomahawks and massacred most of the garrison before they even had a chance to react. Green Bay was likely spared a similar fate only by the loyalty of Gorell's allied tribes and the timely arrival of a delegation of Sioux who were sworn enemies of the Chippewa. Summoned for help, Gorell abandoned his fort. With the aid of 90 warriors from the Sauk, Fox, Menominee, and Winnebago, he paddled to Michilimackinac and successfully negotiated the release of the surviving prisoners. With that, the formal British military occupation of Wisconsin was over, not to be resumed for nearly 50 years. The shock of Pontiac's war forced the British to rethink their entire approach to the Western Territories. The result was the Proclamation of 1763, a landmark piece of legislation that drew a line down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. It forbade any British subjects from purchasing land to the west of that line without a special license from the Crown. This was a direct attempt to prevent the endless encroachment of white settlers onto Indian land, the primary cause of friction. It was a well-intentioned effort to create a permanent boundary, a vast Indian reserve, but it was a line that settlers and land speculators would consistently ignore. The administration of this vast territory was later clarified by the Quebec Act of 1774, which placed Wisconsin under the authority of the Governor of Canada and re-established Mackinac as the official seat of the regional fur trade. Interestingly, the structure of the trade on the ground changed very little. While the capital investment and overall control came from British investors in Montreal, the men who actually paddled the canoes into the wilderness and bartered directly with the tribes were still, for the most part, Frenchmen. They knew the languages, the customs, and the trails. The company had a new board of directors in London, but it kept the same floor managers who knew how to get the job done. This created a strange hybrid system where native trappers supplied French traders who worked for a British-owned enterprise. The core business model, exchanging European goods for American furs, remained exactly the same. When the American Revolution broke out, the Wisconsin tribes were largely uninterested. To them, it was just another internal power struggle between different factions of white men, fought in a distant land over issues that had little to do with them. Some, however, were drawn into the conflict. The influential French Ottawa leader Charles de Langlade, who had fought so hard for the French, now embraced the British cause with equal passion. The British, knowing his sway over the tribes, hoped he could mobilize warriors against the American colonists. Langley did manage to lead some Chippewa and Ottawa east to fight for the British, but he found it difficult to generate much enthusiasm for long, dangerous trips to aid his new allies. Langlade's efforts were largely nullified by the actions of a single American officer, George Rogers Clark. In 1778, Clark, whose campaigns in the West would form the basis for American claims to the Northwest Territory, held a great council of tribes at Cahokia, Illinois. Through a masterful display of diplomacy, he succeeded in obtaining pledges of allegiance to the United States from many of the tribes present. This included the noted Chief Blackbird, who led a mixed village of Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi near Milwaukee, and who remained loyal to the American cause. Clark's influence effectively split the loyalties of the Wisconsin tribes, preventing the British from ever using them as a unified force. The British did manage to assemble about 1,200 Wisconsin warriors for an attack on Spanish-held St. Louis in 1780, but the assault was poorly coordinated and easily repulsed, marking another failure for the British war effort in the West. Even after the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, the British refused to leave. Despite the Treaty of Paris, which officially handed the territory over to the United States, they continued to occupy their key western forts, including the vital post at Mackinac. From these strongholds, they continued to influence and supply the tribes, effectively maintaining a shadow government over the region for another decade. It wasn't until 1796 that the last British troops finally withdrew, but the final act of their long history in Wisconsin was yet to come. When the War of 1812 broke out, the British came storming back. Within a month, they had retaken Mackinac, aided by Menominee and Winnebago warriors from Wisconsin, among whom was a young chief named Oshkosh, a man destined to become a famous leader. A month later, Wisconsin warriors were part of the force that attacked and destroyed Fort Dearborn, the site of modern-day Chicago. The Americans knew that controlling the Mississippi River access at Prairie du Chien was the key to controlling the region. In 1814, they built Fort Shelby there, likely the first time an American flag had ever flown over a building in Wisconsin. The British moved quickly to eliminate it. A combined force of British regulars and about 500 Indian allies, mostly Menominee, Chippewa, Winnebago, and Sioux, forced the American garrison to surrender. They renamed the post Fort McKay and held it against the Americans for the remainder of the war. They finally abandoned it in May of 1815, in accordance with the Treaty of Ghent. With their departure, British, and indeed all European, control of Wisconsin's Indians was finally at an end. A new, more formidable power was now in charge. A nation not of traders and partners, but of settlers and farmers who coveted not the furs on the land, but the land itself. The departure of the British didn't bring peace or independence to the tribes of Wisconsin. It brought a new power, one with a fundamentally different and far more dangerous ambition. The French and the British had been interested in the region's resources, primarily furs. They were corporate operators, exploiting the local labor force to extract a valuable commodity. The Americans were different. They weren't interested in the factory's output. They wanted to demolish the factory and own the land it stood on. For the native peoples of Wisconsin, who had become utterly dependent on the white man's goods, this was a devastating shift. They had long since lost the ability to live as their ancestors had, and now the very ground beneath their feet was the prize in a new game. The United States government arrived with its own system, a cynical and brutally effective machine for acquiring land. It was a three-step process. First, white settlers would illegally squat on Indian territory. Second, when the inevitable conflicts erupted, the army would be called in, not to evict the trespassers, but to protect the whites. Third, in the ensuing peace treaty, the defeated and intimidated tribe would be forced to cede their land as compensation. It was a perfect, repeatable formula for conquest, and it would be applied to Wisconsin until nothing was left. The first major test of this new American reality came in the southwestern corner of Wisconsin, a region rich with lead deposits. The Sauk and Fox had been mining this lead for years, smelting the ore and trading it to Canadian traders for goods. They understood its value, and they rightly feared that once the Americans learned of the rich deposits, their greed would be aroused and the land would be lost. Their reasoning was excellent. By the 1820s, word was out, and a rush of professional miners, particularly Cornish immigrants, began to pour into the region. By 1827, the trickle had become a flood. The Indians were, in the words of one account, rudely expelled from their diggings, their mines appropriated by armed white men who had no legal claim to them. The simmering resentment boiled over in 1827 through the actions of a young Winnebago chief named Redbird. In an act of protest and rage, he killed 2 settlers and, in a shocking display, scalped a baby. He and his warriors then celebrated with a drunken carousel before attacking 2 keel boats on the Wisconsin River, killing several of the crew. The American response was swift and overwhelming. Troops quickly flooded the area, and Redbird, seeing the hopelessness of his situation, chose to prevent a war he knew his people could not win. On the 3rd of September, 1827, in a moment of great dignity and drama, Redbird voluntarily surrendered to the American major at Portage, knowing he was likely marching to his own death. His sacrifice did not save his people's land. The incident was used as the perfect pretext. In the 18th of July 29, a grand council was held at Prairie du Chien, where the Winnebago, along with the Potawatomi, Chippewa, and Ottawa, were forced to cede the entire rich lead mining country of southwestern Wisconsin to the United States. The first turn of the American machine was complete. While this was happening, another movement was underway. Between 1821 and 1834, a migration of displaced tribes from New York, including the Oneida, Muncie, Stockbridge, and Brotherton, were settled in Wisconsin. They were Christians, farmers, and were seen by the U.S. government as a good influence. In a deeply ironic twist, the Menominee tribe agreed to cede 500,000 acres of their own land to provide a home for these fellow native people who had already been dispossessed. It was a generous act in a world that was rapidly running out of generosity. What happened next was not a war. It was, as one historian later termed it, more of a systematic extermination of Indians by whites, hardly deserving the term war. At the center of it was Black Hawk, a respected leader of the Sauk. His main village, a large settlement of some 500 families, was located at the mouth of the Rock River in Illinois. His people were known as the British Band because of their sympathies during the War of 1812, a fact that made them a target for American resentment. As early as 1823, white settlers began squatting on Black Hawk's land, fencing in the tribe's cornfields, burning their wigwams, and mistreating their women. This was all in direct violation of a treaty that said the Sauk could remain until the land was officially surveyed and sold. Desperate, Black Hawk traveled to Canada to consult with his old allies, the British. An agent there told him the American settlers were violating the treaty and that he could rightfully resist. It was the worst advice he would ever receive. On the 6th of April, 1832, Black Hawk crossed back into Illinois with approximately 1,000 of his people, only about 400 of whom were warriors. The rest were women, children, and the elderly. He had been led to believe that other tribes like the Potawatomi and Winnebago, and even the British themselves, would come to his aid. He quickly realized it was all a fantasy. No help was coming. The Illinois militia had been called out, and Black Hawk, now understanding his mistake, only wanted to make peace and get his people safely back to Iowa. He sent messengers under a white flag to the camp of Major Stillman, who commanded a force of nearly 400 volunteers nearby. The white flag, the universal symbol of truce, was ignored. The Americans took the messengers prisoner, and when another group of Indians approached to observe, the soldiers opened fire, killing 3 of them. Black Hawk had only 40 warriors with him at the time. He was outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. But he was enraged by this treachery. In what he himself later called a suicide charge, he led his 40 warriors in a furious attack against Stillman's men. The result was one of the most embarrassing routs in American military history. At the first volley from the charging warriors, the entire force of volunteers broke and fled in a wild, frantic panic. They spread the alarm across northern Illinois, wildly claiming they had been ambushed by 2,000 of Black Hawk's fiercest braves. The incident became known as Stillman's Run, and it turned Black Hawk's peaceful return into a fight for survival. Now Black Hawk and his entire band, encumbered by their women and children, were fugitives. A massive force of militia and regular U.S. Army troops was mobilized to hunt them down. They fled north, through the area of modern-day Madison, Wisconsin, a desperate, starving trek through unfamiliar swamps and forests. The pursuing army finally overtook them on the 21st of July, as they were attempting to cross the Wisconsin River. At the Battle of Wisconsin Heights, Black Hawk's warriors fought a brilliant and desperate rearguard action, holding off the entire American force long enough for the non-combatants to get across the river. It was a tactical victory, but it only delayed the inevitable. By the time the exhausted band reached the Mississippi River at the mouth of the Bad Axe River, they were starving and cornered. As they arrived, the steamboat Warrior appeared on the river. Black Hawk again attempted to surrender. He raised a white flag and called out that he wanted to come aboard. The captain of the Warrior chose to believe it was a trick. He ordered his men to open fire with a cannon loaded with canister shot, shredding the crowd of men, women, and children gathered on the shore. The next morning, the infantry arrived and attacked the Indians from the rear. What followed was a 3-hour massacre. Men, women, and children were forced into the Mississippi River at bayonet point. Many who tried to swim for the opposite shore were picked off by American sharpshooters lining the banks. Those who tried to flee to islands were hunted down. At least 150 people were killed outright, and as many more drowned in their attempt to escape. The horror was not over. General Atkinson, the American commander, had brought a band of Sioux warriors with him for one specific purpose. He unleashed them on the approximately 300 Sauk who had managed to make it to the other side of the river. The Sioux fell upon the exhausted survivors and killed about half of them. Of the 1,000 people who had crossed into Illinois with Black Hawk in April, only about 150 remained alive 4 months later. The war was over. Black Hawk himself escaped, but was later surrendered by a band of Winnebago. He was taken on a tour of the eastern states, a living trophy to be paraded through American cities to impress upon him the overwhelming power of the United States government. He was eventually released and died on a small reservation in Iowa in 1838. The Black Hawk War, and especially the brutal lesson of the Bad Axe Massacre, broke the will of any remaining tribal resistance in Wisconsin. The floodgates of land cession were thrown open. The process was swift, relentless, and bureaucratic. In the 18th of September 32, just a month after the massacre, the Winnebago were forced to cede all the rest of their holdings south and east of the Fox and Wisconsin rivers. In 1833, the Southern Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi signed away their lands in southern Wisconsin. In 1836, the Menominee ceded a massive tract of nearly 4 million acres between Green Bay and the Wolf River. In 1837, in 3 separate treaties, the Chippewa, Sioux, and Winnebago ceded the entire western half of Wisconsin above the Wisconsin River. In 1838, the recently arrived Oneida were forced to cede most of the land that had just been granted to them. The final piece fell into place in 1848, the same year Wisconsin became a state. The Menominee signed away their last small holdings. With that final stroke of the pen, the United States government now held title to virtually all Indian land in Wisconsin. The decades of work were complete. The tribes, who had once been masters of a vast domain, now owned nothing. The only step left was the physical removal. The Army forcibly removed many of the Winnebago to a reservation in Nebraska, though many, homesick for Wisconsin and terrified of the Sioux, would gradually wander back over the years. Finally, in 1854, the government established reservations. The Menominee were given a plot of land on the upper Wolf River, and the Chippewa were assigned 3 large reservations in the north. The eviction was complete. The original owners of the land were now confined to a few small corners of their former homeland, living as wards of the very government that had taken everything from them. By 1854, the hostile takeover of Wisconsin was complete. The original inhabitants had been run through a brutal machine of war, disease, and bureaucratic theft until all their land was gone. The American government now possessed the deed to the entire state. But a question remained: what to do with the people? The solution was twofold. For some, forced exile to strange lands west of the Mississippi. For others, containment on small, isolated pockets of their former homeland called reservations. The Great Eviction was over, and the long, difficult era of survival had begun. This is what happened to the employees after the factory was seized and demolished. For many tribes, the end of the land cessions meant the end of their story in Wisconsin. They were marched or moved west, scattered across the plains and beyond. The Sauk and Fox, whose merged tribe was forged in the crucible of the Fox Wars and whose final resistance was crushed at the Bad Axe River, were sent away. By the mid-20th century, their descendants were living on 3 separate reservations: a small one in Iowa, another in Kansas, and a third in Oklahoma, thousands of people living hundreds of miles from their ancestral home on the Wisconsin River. The Kickapoo, once allies of the Fox, were similarly dispersed, with small reservations in Oklahoma and Kansas, and one particularly stubborn band that traveled all the way to Coahuila, Mexico, seeking a place where they could finally be left alone. The fate of the Muscatan tribe is a historical mystery, a testament to how thoroughly a people can be broken and erased. Once a significant power in Wisconsin, they vanished from the records. Most historians believe their survivors were absorbed into the prairie band of the Potawatomi, and their descendants are now found scattered among the Kickapoo in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Mexico, a forgotten people living under another tribe's name. And the Santee Sioux, who were among the first residents of Wisconsin that Nicolay met, were also pushed out. By 1940, their descendants were living primarily on a reservation in Nebraska and in communities in Minnesota. The great engine of American expansion had not just conquered tribes, it had atomized them, scattering their remnants across the continent. For the tribes who were allowed to stay, life became a matter of confinement. By the 1940s, the Native American population of Wisconsin was just under 14,000 people, living on a fractured landscape of reservations and public land allotments. The Chippewa, or Ojibwe, were the most numerous group, with over 5,000 people living on several reservations in the state's North Woods, including Lac Courte Oreille, Lac du Flambeau, and Bad River. The Menominee, numbering around 2,500, were located on a single reservation in Shawano County. Next to them lived the Stockbridge and Munsee, a small band of just a few hundred people who had come from the east seeking sanctuary, only to be caught in the same net. The Oneida, another of the eastern transplants, numbered around 1,700, living not on a reservation but on scattered lands near their village west of Green Bay. Perhaps the most poignant story is that of the Winnebago, or Ho-Chunk. After being systematically stripped of their lands, many were forcibly removed by the U.S. Army to a reservation in Nebraska, but the removal failed. Homesick for the forests and lakes of Wisconsin and terrified of their old enemies, the Sioux, more than half of the tribe gradually wandered back. They returned to their homeland to find they no longer had any claim to it. They lived as vagabonds and squatters on public domain land, primarily in Jackson and Wood counties. They were ghosts in their own house, a people so tied to their land that they chose a life of poverty and uncertainty at home over a life of exile. By 1940, there were more Winnebago living without a reservation in Wisconsin than there were living on their official reservation in Nebraska. Life inside the fences of the reservation system was not easy. The land the tribes were given was often the least desirable, unsuitable for the large-scale agriculture that now dominated the American economy. Finding a way to earn a decent living was their greatest difficulty. Even for the Menominee, who were considered the most economically prosperous tribe in the state thanks to a well-managed tribal lumbering industry, the standard of living was not high. For most, life was a constant struggle, marked by a lack of adequate food and clothing, especially during the harsh northern winters. The old ways of total self-sufficiency were gone, but the new economic system offered few points of entry. This hardship spurred a new migration. A considerable number of native people began moving to cities to find employment. By the 1940s, an estimated 1,000 Indians were living in Milwaukee, the largest group being Oneida. They were trading the rural poverty of the reservation for the urban challenges of the factory and the tenement. This migration created a new and complex debate within the government and society. The official hope of the United States government was, of course, that eventually the Indians would be assimilated. They would be absorbed by the rest of the population, abandon their old ways, and live normal lives as American citizens. But there was a growing concern, even then, that something precious would be lost in the process, that the entire colorful pattern of Indian culture and tradition would vanish. One thing was certain. The tribes of Wisconsin, along with nearly all native peoples across the United States, had suffered immensely at the hands of the white man. They had been pushed, prodded, fought, and tricked from an existence of total independence to one of near-total dependence. They had been made into employees in a fur trade that hollowed out their culture, and then were summarily fired when their land became more valuable than their labor. They were promised protection and partnership, and were delivered dispossession and poverty. They deserved, then as now, constructive help in navigating the final, demanding terms of the civilization that had been forced upon them. From partners to employees, and from employees to exiles. The fur trade offered a deal that seemed too good to refuse, but the real cost was paid over 2 centuries with land, blood, and a way of life. This history isn't dead, it's just buried. We dig it up so it isn't forgotten. If you learn something they don't teach in school, subscribe for more.